They belonged to Norwegians who crossed the North Sea following the German invasion of their country in 1940. Most of those who died were regulars, but some belonged to a band of adventurers who fought a war without flags, manning the Shetland Bus.
The Shetland Bus, first of all, brought out potential agents from Norway, who were then trained in SOE's training schools and sent back as agents, intelligence agents, and saboteur. The bus also took in large quantities of explosives and other material for the use of these people. And certainly in the early years of the war, before we were able to send in many agents by air, they played a pretty vital part in landing these people down the very lengthy coast of Norway.
There had been a price to pay. The good Norwegians, as they were called, had to fight a treacherous and brutal war. Imprisoned, tortured, and often sent to concentration camps, thousands of Norwegians died.
Nazism was evil, and I think you should fear no evil, but fight it. Without our common fight against Nazism, I don't think the world would have been a world to live in.
Erling Rønneberg, 20, native of Ålesund, Secret Service, occupation student.
10,000 Norwegians, tens of millions in Europe and around the world. I think their sacrifice was not in vain. This is my private war museum. This is my radio set used for night contact with home station in Britain. A pair of binoculars which are used for the observing of German ships. This is the revolver which I always kept in my pocket. And a US carbine which was also part of my equipment.
Norway was unwillingly incorporated into the Greater Germanic Union in April 1940. Hitler had been reluctant to invade, and following French and British intervention, considered ordering a retreat into neutral Sweden. However, the Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht eventually swept aside any resistance. The German conquerors were aided by a fifth column under the command of Vidkun Quisling. Quisling, whose very name became synonymous with that of traitor, led the National Samling, or Norwegian Nazi Party. Before the invasion, Quisling had been in Germany, plotting with the Nazi hierarchy how he and his supporters could stab Norway in the back. Quisling served his German masters well. His treachery helped secure vital raw materials for Hitler's war machine. And once France fell, Norway provided the northern sector of a powerful arc, stretching from Narvik in the north to Saint-Jean-de-Luz in France. At its focus was Britain.
Oh, I felt ill. I came in a lorry and I was stamping about and singing their songs they always did sing on the march, and it made you feel really ill.
They were very arrogant, and we didn't like the look of it. It didn't appeal to us at all. And their marching song was Wir fahren gegen England.
As the end came in June, King Haakon VII, his family and his government, waiting in the town of Mulda for passage to England, were nearly blown into exile by the Luftwaffe.
I saw the German planes raining down incendiaries. The whole town was up in flames in no time. And I cried because I felt it was so dreadful. I decided more or less then that if there was a chance, I would get to England and help, give my little help towards the war and to get a free land again. Because we all outdoor country.
Even in the confusion of his flight, uppermost in the king's mind were the means for his eventual return to Norway. For this, he didn't just need the support of the Allies, he needed the support of his subjects.
Kære landsmænd, når jeg nå på denne måde skal søge at komme i forbindelse med dere derhjemme.
He talked us into it in a sort of such an appealing way of speaking for the fatherland. And of course that affected us, swelling up the hearts, and we'll do it.
Escape was usually by boat, striking out across the North Sea with Shetland as the first landfall. So many took the route, Lerwick became known as Little Norway.
Stole a boat, as hundreds of others did. We hadn't a navigator, we hadn't a skipper. I was 21 at that time, young, eager, desperately interested in getting across the North Sea to fight.
Ragnar Ulstein, age 21, native of Ulsteinvik, SOE operative, occupation, student.
They didn't come to save their skins or to sell their boats. They came over as a means of getting onto British soil as the base from which they could resist the Germans.
Leif Larsen, age 35, native of Bergen, skipper, Shetland gang, occupation, seaman.
We boarded a little fishing vessel and went over it to Shetland. And from there we were sent down to London to patriotic school, stayed there for a few days. And then we were asked what we would like to do. And I said, I'm going to sail to Norway, do jobs there. Because sailing, being on the sea, that's my work.
Obtaining information about conditions inside Norway was vital. The only reliable sources were the Norwegian refugees themselves. The decision to leave Norway and to sail for the British Isles was never an easy one. Families left behind faced interrogation. The fathers of young men, more often than not, were sent to concentration camps. Rather than put their families to even greater risk, they simply disappeared. The long and hazardous boat journey could only be made after running a gauntlet of deadly obstacles. First, there were the gun emplacements the Germans had built to stop the expected invasion. Once past these, there were still German patrol boats. And the enemy net was extended even further out to sea by the Luftwaffe. The traffic with Norway ceased to be one way when in June, Norwegian commandos sabotaged the railway line near Bergen. Shetland would no longer simply be a place of sanctuary. It would become a base for the eventual liberation of Norway. To achieve this, it was essential to build up a network of agents, to arm resistance fighters, and to keep open the lines of communication between occupied Norway and the Allies in Britain. Native Norwegians were ideal candidates for undercover work. The best way in and out was by inconspicuous fishing boats, so easily lost amongst the native fishing fleet working off the Norwegian coast. The boats and their crews were riding at anchor in Shetland. The organization that eventually emerged from this unlikely flotsam of war often defied traditional military description and discipline. Officially, it was called Military Establishment No. 7. And although it was a naval unit, controlled in theory by the Admiralty, its commanding officers could be either from the Army or the Royal Navy. To confuse the chain of command further, orders were given by British intelligence. Unofficially, it was called the Shetland Bus. Not surprisingly, the name stuck.
It began in a very small way when a handful of fishing boats turned up from Norway, and it seemed to the British authorities that these boats and their crews might be used to start a shuttle service back to Norway. And this developed from very small beginnings into a really major operation.
You needed to reinforce Norwegian morale by demonstrating that the Germans weren't all powerful. They may think they run the coastline, but there's so many holes in it, they'll never be able to control it completely.
Major Leslie Mitchell, age 26, Commission General List, 1940.
Mitchell had been sent to Shetland to gather information from Norwegian refugees, and in the winter of 1940, he was the obvious man to set up the Shetland Bus. By the spring of 1941, it was clear he couldn't continue the job single-handed.
David Howarth, age 28, Lieutenant Royal Navy, civilian occupation, worked for the BBC.
I was a very junior naval officer at the time, and gave me the job of looking after the boats and the crews.
I was Mitchell's adjutant, right hand.
Arthur Slater, age 28, Royal Marines, civilian occupation, executive.
I just loved every moment of it, and all I did was really to try and support the old laird of Shetland, as we used to call him.
Those who made the dangerous passage were usually young, tough, and self-reliant. Many joined the regular Norwegian armed forces, or the merchant navy, which lost over 4,000 men during the war. It was amongst these refugees that British intelligence, particularly the Special Operations Executive, hoped to gain recruits. In all, 650 Norwegians received SOE training.
We wanted to be pilots in the Air Force. I said to the interrogation officer, I felt rather uneasy about this, as it would take such a long time, 9 months, and I thought that the war will be its climax. And he looked at me and said, I'll send you to a man I know.
Martin Linger, age 46, native of Oslo, captain, Norwegian Army, civilian occupation, actor.
Linger was an early SOE recruit, and it was his job to find fellow Norwegians prepared to join the secret war being carried out in Norway.
He just asked me, are you married? No. Good. Then we don't have to care about the wife. Driving, he said, they are driving you very hard. You have to learn in 2 months much more than you will learn ordinary in 2 years.
You learned about the weapons, the planes, warships, and such things. After that, we went to parachute training. We got 3 jumps just to know what it was. All the things you needed to become a real spy, more or less.
In December 1941, Linger left London to take part in Operation Archery, a joint Norwegian-British commander raid on the island of Molloy. Archery followed 2 successful operations carried out against the Lofoten Islands earlier in the year. Though this operation was equally successful, the price of success was Linger's life. Fortunately, he left a nucleus of men trained to continue the struggle for Norway's liberation. One of these men was Leif Larsen. Linger first interviewed him early in 1941. Larsen was selected for training. It would not be as an agent inside Norway that Larsen earned his fame. That came to Shetland Larsen, as he's still known in Norway, as a skipper on the Shetland Bus.
I was put into the Linge company at first, but we were transferred to the Shetland gang.
Larsen was the most extraordinary man of his kind that I ever met. He was such a brave man that nobody ever bothered to refer to it. One took it for granted that if he found himself in some awful position, he would be the man who would find his way out of it. In the end, he got more British naval decorations than anybody else, in spite of being a Norwegian.
Larsen was awarded the Conspicuous Gallantry Medal, the Distinguished Service Order, the Distinguished Service Cross, and the Distinguished Service Medal and Bar. The marriage that spawned the infant Shetland Bus organization was between 2 antagonistic British partners. One was the long-established Special Intelligence Service, the SIS. The other was the newly formed Special Operations Executive. The SOE was eager to carry out Churchill's direct orders to set Europe ablaze by whatever means possible, be it poison pill, silenced pistol, or plastic explosive.
The 2 organizations weren't terribly fond of each other. The SOE, as the newcomer, was rather despised by the old established SIS. There is a good deal of evidence of positive infighting between the 2, which didn't help the war effort much.
The SIS thinking that these SOE people made too much noise, blowing up factories, railways, or whatever it might be. And they never really got the meaning of it. So I called the SOE people for the dynamite gang, not in a way of honor, I think.
There was also Milorg, the military organization, initially established under the command of General Otto Ruger. It built a civilian army inside Norway, which would eventually merge with the regular forces.
They had a fairly difficult career. They were found out once or twice in the early days by the Germans, and many of them were disposed of. By the end of the war, they were a going concern. There was completely peaceful transition in Norway simply because the Milorg forces appeared from nowhere and took over.
The Shetland Bus was a private navy, carrying goods and personnel for Milorg, the SIS, and the SOE. The operations planned in London were launched from Shetland. Kiergaard House was the last billet for agents setting off on their missions. Those involved knew it as Flemington.
Our main purpose was to settle the agents down. If they had a waiting period of, say, 5 days, the fourth day could show anxiety. Some chaps just walked off as if they were going home on a Friday night from town.
Those who were nervous or had nerve problems were those who did not get into them and stayed behind in Scotland.
Although Major Mitchell from his base at Flemington had overall command, day-to-day responsibility for the boats and crews belonged to Lieutenant David Howarth, who lived with the crews at Luna. Luna had been chosen for its isolation. Operations could be prepared and launched from the harbour in secrecy. They were carried out only in the winter months, when the nights are long and the days are short. Avoiding one enemy meant battling with another, the weather. The weather sank more boats than the Germans. David Howarth was the last person the crew spoke with before setting out.
A Norwegian fishing boat has a very distinctive sound. You can hear it miles away. If I was up at the house, I ran down to the quay to see who it was who was coming. First thing I could see was usually the mast growing gradually behind the headland, but I couldn't at first see who it was. The waiting was awful.
London had no idea how the demands on the crews and their boats would grow. Round trips of over 300 miles were common, and some of over 2,000 miles were also made in boats never intended for constant long-distance journeys.
I had to go in many places where I never had been before. We had the usual means for navigating, so we had our drafts, we had a compass, depth sonar, but it wasn't as easy as all that.
We always looked at the charts ourselves and decided whether it was a feasible operation or not. I knew that it only needed a single omission on my part to forget something, and the whole thing would have come to grief, and another crew would be lost.
The boats had sails and a one-cylinder engine which, with luck, might produce 8 knots. Fine for offshore work, but not for crossing the North Sea in winter. Journeys made in these wooden boats, which varied in length from 45 to 70 feet, were dangerously slow. If the disguise as an innocent fishing boat failed to fool the enemy, a Shetland Bus had to stand and fight. It only took a few seconds to break out the Lewis guns, cleverly hidden inside oil drums, and heavy-caliber machine guns were readily to hand. Even so, there was no escaping the fact that a Shetland Bus was a slow, vulnerable target. As was his usual practice, David Howarth blessed the crew of the Siglaus with bad luck as they set off from Luna in October 1941. She carried the usual mix of weapons and agents. On her return, she would carry refugees, including some of the 700 Jews the resistance saved from the gas chambers. Jacob Jensen's father used the family home on the island of Bumlo as a safe house for refugees. A group were waiting in the house on the night the Siglaus arrived. Against all the rules, one of the crew, Jacob's elder brother Niels, went to the house.
It was late in the evening and we children had been put to bed. I heard there were strangers in the kitchen. I recognized Niels' voice and crept downstairs and peeked into the kitchen, and I saw Niels. I was immediately shown back upstairs, as we children had to be kept clear of such things.
That was the last time Jakob and his family saw Niels.
They sailed around midnight on the Friday, and they were discovered by a German aircraft which swept by 3 times and showered them with bullets. On the last sweep, Niels was hit. He was at the wheel of the Zyglos when that happened.
Niels was the first of many casualties suffered by the Shetland gang. A secure Norway, run by a collaborationist government supported by a small number of German troops, had been a fine present to offer Hitler. It was one he greedily accepted. But he'd been sadly misled regarding the cost of permanently securing Norway. Certainly there were Norwegians who supported Quisling. 40,000 belonged to the National Samling Party and its youth wing, the Herd, at the start of the war. Norwegians served in the ranks of the SS. Others worked enthusiastically with the Gestapo and the police to crush the resistance.
There were collaborators, of course, there were hundreds of them, but they were not so dangerous to us as we knew them. They were identified as the talkative Norwegian or the agent serving in the German security police. And they were perhaps the most dangerous of all enemies in Norway during the war.
It was not simply the increasing active and passive resistance which forced Germany to divert a disproportionate amount of men and material to Norway. As the war progressed, so Norway's strategic value grew. From their Norwegian bases, the Germans were able to strike with impunity at Allied convoys bound for the Soviet ports of Murmansk and Archangel. More than one Shetland bus would be lost, attempting to blunt the offensive against the convoys. The Allies, too, turned the country's long and isolated coastline to their advantage. The Germans could never be certain if the next Shetland bus, with a cargo of arms and agents, heralded the long-expected invasion. By the war's end, over 300,000 German troops were tied down in Norway. The cycle of resistance and repression had its own grim logic. On the night of the 10th of August, 1941, the Gestapo captured the fishing boat Vigo, loaded with refugees. 16 of them were summarily executed. In September, it became a crime punishable by death to flee Norway. Then, in October 1941, mass terror tactics were introduced when Reich Commissar Josef Treboven oversaw the destruction of the town of Televarg. Although it was rebuilt after the war, Norwegians still think of it as the town that died. Just 200 miles from Shetland, Televarg was no stranger to the Shetland bus. Simon of Tretveit remembers the day that 2 agents were hiding in the attic of Lauritz Teller's house.
Our man was sent by the Nazis to find out about the boats. He pretended that he wanted to go to England. Many had done so before him, and people here tended to speak too easily. And this made him suspect that somebody was staying here, and he must have reported back to the Nazis. 2 days later, they sent guards to surround the house, and 2 Gestapo men went in with a German officer to arrest them. There was a fight. The 2 Gestapo men were shot dead, the German officer was wounded, and one of the agents was wounded and captured. The other was killed. Then the arrests began. They found a list of names on these 2 boys, contact persons here and in other parts of the country, and they were all rounded up to be shot. My father was taken. That was on the Sunday morning. The next Thursday, a boatload of German troops arrived early in the morning before anyone was awake. All the men were herded together, and at midday we were put into a barn, and the German soldiers piled charges of dynamite round the walls. We expected they would blow us up right away, but after a while we were taken out and ordered up on a small hill. Treboven and his staff were there. They fired a signal pistol, and as we stood there and watched, they began to blow up the village. First Lauritz Teller's house, then our house, then the others, one by one.
On Treboven's orders, the ringleaders were tortured, then shot. Of the other villagers, the men were sent to concentration camps in Germany, where many of them died. Before the women could be shipped to Germany, diphtheria struck. Under the watchful eye of a Norwegian doctor, the epidemic continued long enough for those who did survive to remain imprisoned in Norway. The Germans made no secret of this atrocity. They took photographs as the town was razed to the ground. Here was a warning to all Norwegians of the price to be paid for further resistance. On the 28th of October, 1942, Leif Larsen set sail from Luna in the Arthur, a 60-foot fishing boat he had recently found in Norway. His target? The Tirpitz. Like her sister ship, the Bismarck, the Tirpitz was the pride of Hitler's surface fleet. The 52,000-ton battleship, with a top speed of 31 knots, mounting 8 15-inch guns as main armament, was formidable. German naval ambitions were limited by geography. The superior Royal Navy could bottle up the German fleet and starve the Reich into submission. Hitler's victories in Western and Northern Europe offered his admirals new freedom with outlets into the Atlantic and Arctic waters. It was to these waters that Tirpitz steamed in January 1942. At Trondheim Fjord, she was joined by other ships of the German fleet, waiting to cut the supply lines established following the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. Allied supplies were essential to help restore the shattered Red Army. These could only be supplied through the Arctic ports of Murmansk and Archangel. On July the 4th, 1942, the Tirpitz and her escort closed on convoy PQ-17. The order was given for the 35 merchant ships carrying equipment for 50,000 men to scatter. Only 11 ships reached Archangel. Submarines and aircraft executed the massacre, but fear of the Tirpitz was behind the order to scatter. Leif Larsen and David Howarth had considered packing a fishing boat with explosives to ram the battleship. That plan was dismissed as impracticable. However, a group from the Royal Navy were experimenting with a new weapon, a two-man torpedo called a chariot. Driven by a battery-powered motor, the chariot carried a 600-pound warhead that could be attached to the hull of a ship by magnets. Larsen sailed the Arthur to Loch Cairnborn, where a series of mock raids were carried out against the battleship HMS Rodney. These proved an attack on Tirpitz was feasible, provided Larsen could get the chariots and crews close enough. To pass the German inspection, a special compartment was built in the already cramped hold of the Arthur to take the frogmen. Under the boat, bolts were attached, so the chariots could be towed in, ready for the attack. While these preparations were underway, the Germans issued a death warrant to all members of the Shetland gang and other Allied agents. If captured, they would be shot out of hand. To emphasize the importance of Operation Title, the code name for the attack on Tirpitz, Crown Prince Olaf, the present king, saw the men off. And if Larsen had any doubts about his wooden fishing boat attacking the German battleship, he never raised them. At the mouth of Trondheim Fjord, Larsen recited his cover story that the only cargo the Arthur carried was peat. The Germans commanding the guard boat let him through. Now all that remained was to get within sight of Tirpitz. 5 miles from the target, Larsen's luck ran out. A wave ripped loose the chariots, and they sank. Scuttling the Arthur, Larsen set out to get his men back to Shetland by the only available route, across Norway and into Sweden. Under his leadership, all but one escaped. The Tirpitz raid was the last operation mounted from Luna. By then, Shetland had become an armed camp with a garrison of 40,000 men. David Howarth realized that not only were the Germans perfectly aware of Luna's existence, but that the base was not defendable. So, by the end of 1942, operations were moved to the harbour at Scalloway.
We decided we'd have to move somewhere a bit more civilized, and we closed down Luna and moved the whole base across to the little village of Scalloway, and there it was much easier to organize things. We did, of course, lose in secrecy.
I did the pictures of these agents and made them the exact size, you see, to fit the German passport. Somebody printed the passport cards, just exactly similar to the ones issued in Norway by German militia. They had this replica of the stamp which was put on the photograph, and they forged the commandant's signature on it. And then the man's name was written on it, George Johansson or Johan Johansson, and his size and his height and his eyes, the colour of his eyes. If you asked the Norwegian sailors, where had they been? They would say, oh, we've been to Iceland. At the end of the war, they come back with flowers, and they brought quite a lot of small fir trees back from Norway, which is planted here. It seems funny to see a boat coming in like Burnham Wood going to Dinsenane with all the draperies and vegetation on it, but we knew they hadn't been to Iceland for that.
The move highlighted the peculiar position the Shetland gang enjoyed as Norwegian volunteers serving under British officers. Unlike their fellow Norwegians manning the torpedo boats at nearby Lerwick, they were not under military discipline.
Dave, do you remember writing your reports?
No, I don't. I
refused
never,
to do it.
Yes, I did. I never wrote any reports, as far as I remember.
I always had to ask you what had happened on the trip, and then write it down for you. So all you'd written was...
Oh, yes.
Was a date, left Luna.
Yeah.
And another date, arrived, objective.
Well, you see, I wasn't any good at writing at all, you see. My job was to be a sailor.
No doubt there was an element of professional rivalry involved because the regular Norwegian Navy also organized attacks from Shetland and the east coast of Scotland. And pay for the volunteers of the Shetland gang at £4 a week and £10 for each Norwegian crossing was reasonable. A Norwegian officer, a stickler for discipline, arrived, telling the men that not only would they have to salute officers, but scrub the decks at dawn as well. There was a near riot before he was replaced. For the rest of the war, the Shetland gang was officially designated the Norwegian Naval Independent Unit, with David Howarth and Mitchell's former second-in-command, Arthur Slater, commanding. Mitchell's departure was not the only change at Flemington.
After a year in Shetland and getting to know the people in London headquarters, they fairly quickly came to the conclusion it would be a wonderful thing if this girl of mine could come up to Shetland and run the pub, to wit Flemington, which housed agents either waiting for passage to Norway or coming back to tell their story and to rest before being flown on down to London.
At Flemington, the Slaters used a cover name of Rogers. This was essential because Alice Slater is Norwegian.
Well, I think the War Office dreamt up this thing that we should have an odd name, false name, so that people couldn't pick up my family connections too easily, but I don't know how effective that was. One chap came in and took one look at me, and as he knew my family in Norway, he said, oh yes, I know who you are. So that was blown quite easily. They came and went all the time, and if I'd started whimpering and crying, it wouldn't have helped anybody. But we did have one lot who left us, and a few days later, one cut his throat. The Gestapo were after him. One was caught and terribly tortured and so on. So, of course, one couldn't help thinking of all those things, but it was no use, carrying on.
In February 1943, the SOE launched Operation Gunnerside to cripple the Norse heavy water facility at Rjukan.
The most important piece of sabotage was the destruction of the heavy water plant, which might have been crucial had the Germans been allowed to go on with their heavy water experiments. They might have reached the atom bomb before we did or at the same time, and that, of course, would have changed the whole course of the war.
British commandos had tried to blow it up, but they had met with bad weather and disaster, so about 40 people had been killed in the first trial, and so the Allied command had thought of bombing the place, but they had decided that they would make one more trial with a small Norwegian group, and that was the group I was going to lead.
Joachim Rönenberg, age 23, native of Ålesund, SOE operative, civilian occupation, student.
I think this is a typical Allied operation. The British gave us the training, they gave us the equipment, they gave us the intelligence for the job, together with some of the Norwegian engineers from Wehrmacht.
A year prior to the Telemark raid, a Shetland bus, the Olaf, sailed to collect 2 men at Flekkefjord. One was the plant's engineer, Einar Skinnerland, who carried plans for the SOE to examine. The other had been Martin Linger's right-hand man.
Odd Starheim, age 23, native of Farsen, SOE operative, civilian occupation, student.
A radio message warned Starheim the Olaf couldn't keep the rendezvous. On the 14th of March 1942, he boarded a freighter at Flekkefjord with a number of friends. On the bridge, he produced a pistol and calmly informed the captain his next port of call was Aberdeen. A few days later, the plans for Norsk Hydro were in London. Starheim was killed on a similar mission in 1943.
These operations were quite brilliant. They destroyed the plant, and then they destroyed the remaining stocks of heavy water which were being taken back to Germany. And that really was the end of the Germans' experimentation in this field.
By early 1943, the Shetland bus faced a crisis brought on by its own success. London wanted more agents and arms sent in. Engine spares were a constant problem, as they were only available in Norway. David Howarth had to buy them from a German-run factory on the island of Bumlo. Apart from trading with the enemy to maintain the fleet, 2 winters had taken their toll, with 6 boats, 45 crew, and nearly 100 passengers lost. Replacement boats were becoming scarce.
The Germans were short of oil. There was not enough oil in Norway for enough large seagoing fishing boats to be able to go to sea.
A temporary solution came when 4 70-foot Icelandic whalers were handed over. Then, in March and April 1943, disaster struck, not once, but twice. Leif Larsen was forced to abandon one of the whalers after an attack by German aircraft. Once again, he brought home the survivors.
We were 8 men, and 2 of them were not wounded. There were several light casualties, but Nils Vika died.
On his 17th birthday, he came and said, "You told me you could go to sea when I could go to sea when I was 17. I said, I didn't. I told you couldn't go before you were 17. It's quite a different thing. But he pressed me, and in the end I let him go, and he was shot."
On his return to Scalloway, Larsen learnt of the loss of a second whaler and the execution of her crew after an attack by E-boats off the Norwegian coast. The need for suitable replacements was now desperate. To David Howarth's alarm, none were available in Britain. Admiral Chester Nimitz of the United States Navy saved the day. On his orders, 3 sleek 110-foot sub-chasers were dispatched from New York to the Clyde. The men of the Shetland gang could hardly believe their luck. Not only were the newly christened Vigra, Hitra and Hesse a match for anything the Germans had, they were equipped with unheard-of luxuries, hot and cold running water, and a galley complete with toaster. Now the Shetland bus could offer an express service.
We all went down to the Clyde gaggle of all more or less drunk, to collect them. And we took 3 American engineers and 1 American skipper, and we set off and went up to Scalloway, and very proudly drove these things like miniature destroyers into Scalloway Harbour. And it really almost became easy compared with the fishing boat days.
The sub-chasers couldn't have arrived at a better time. With the plans for D-Day being finalized, the Shetland Bus was busier than ever. Larsen alone made 34 crossings in one season.
The main objective was to keep the Germans occupied, keep as many Germans as possible in Norway, away from what was to be the fighting front in Normandy in 1944.
By sending in more arms and agents to stiffen resistance, hundreds of thousands of German troops were in the wrong place at the right time.
We had dreamed of leaving Norway, and we dreamed of getting back. And our first mission to Norway fulfilled that dream.
As always, intelligence on the movement of troops and shipping was crucial to the Allies. As the tempo of resistance increased, so did Nazi repression. Even as Germany faced defeat, the brutal efficiency of the Gestapo continued, assisted by Norwegian secret police collaborators. In the closing days of the war, the Gestapo captured 2 resistance workers, both recent passengers on a Shetland bus.
Sverre Roald, age 24, native of Vigra, civilian occupation, fisherman.
He worked for the SOE, using his own boats for rendezvous with the Shetland Bus. Against normal practice, he found a hideout for SIS radio operator Erling Ronneberg at Vartdal.
A hiding place was well hidden with a very difficult access. It gave great safety at the same time as it offered the best possibilities you could get for observations of German shipping.
Luck was always an important element in the life of a resistance worker. Sverre Roald's ran out in April 1945. He came to Ålesund with a report for the next Shetland bus. At a checkpoint, he tried to explain away his lost passbook. But how to explain away the secret documents and his sweetheart, a tiny wireless receiver?
We had maps showing various military installations in the area. We also had information on the station at Vartdal that was sending back intelligence to the SIS via the Shetland Bus.
With the radio and reports, the Germans could roll up the entire network and even destroy the Shetland Bus. But at first, they thought they were dealing with a passbook violation. Roald, hoping to alert his contacts to his predicament, asked to be escorted by a German to the police station. Once the Germans realized the importance of their discovery, he was subjected to a round of systematic beatings and interrogation.
I had written myself off completely. The worst was to think about the ones that thought about you.
He was especially afraid of what would happen to the sub-chaser that was coming this night and which he was supposed to meet.
He lied about the rendezvous point, but not about the broadcast confirming the sub-chaser's arrival. His ruse worked. While the Germans waited to spring their trap with Roald as bait, 2 sub-chasers carried out their missions either side of the Germans. But Sverre Roald's position was now desperate. So too was Erling Ronneberg's.
I was dragged out of the sleeping bag. My hands were tied behind. I hung unconscious, as it appeared, between 2 German soldiers, keeping me standing. I had a 3rd German soldier pressing a machine pistol into my stomach.
Rather than face interrogation, he decided to take his own life.
I suddenly tore myself loose from the ties. I made a leap towards the cliff. The machine pistol said red hot iron burnt into my body, and I dropped.
Wrapped in his sleeping bag, the severely wounded Ronneberg was dragged down the mountain by the Germans.
In the late afternoon, I was brought on board a German watchboat and taken to the quay in Ålesund. 2 Gestapo men came and had a look into the cabin. Stretcher bearers came. They took me into an ambulance, and I was brought to the Ålesund Municipal Hospital. The Gestapo phoned the next morning asking if I was dead. Not yet, the doctor said, but it won't take very long now.
The Gestapo decided time was running out. Ronneberg was moved the following evening.
I think that was my darkest hour. I ended up at the German Naval Field Hospital just outside Ålesund. I was told that as soon as I was well enough, I would be taken to Trondheim. I knew I would end up in the Gestapo torture chamber there. I lay naked at night, hoping to catch pneumonia. To my despair, I got better and better.
Fortunately for both men and the thousands of others in the hands of the Nazis, the Citizens' Army of Milorg seized power on May the 7th, 1945.
Their main role was to, as soon as the armistice arrived, to step in and ensure that the Germans didn't go and blow up all their factories and generally go berserk. And that they did very successfully.
It was on the 7th in the evening we received the good news in prison. I was sent in a cigarette with greetings from a good friend. And immediately the church bells began to ring.
My room was filled by German soldiers wishing me all luck. I walked down the staircase by my own help. Outside, a car was waiting. Outside, freedom and life waited. It was like I should rise from the dead.
On the 9th of May, the Vigra, Hitra and Hesse cast off from Scalloway and set out in broad daylight for Norway. They were followed by a few remaining fishing boats. Having delivered nearly 200 agents and over 400 tons of equipment, this was the Shetland gang's last mission. It was time to return home.
We got 2 homelands during the war, actually. When you were in England, you were always talking about going home, thinking of Norway. And once you landed in Norway, you started talking about home, and then you thought of England. And even today, we have a feeling that England is our second country, actually.
King Haakon delayed his return until June, arriving 5 years to the day after he had been forced into exile. His enemies were vanquished, Quisling awaited trial and subsequent execution, Treboven had committed suicide. Waiting on the quayside were the survivors of the Linger Company and the Shetland gang. A few days after taking the salute from the Milorg forces, the king abolished the wartime organizations. Peace had returned to Norway.
The first lot that went back home with the king and the royal family, they had a tremendous reception. When we got back home on a Swedish steamer on the end of November in 1945, nobody knew we had arrived. There was one single docker on the quayside.
Ja, var det värt det? Du känner det att vi hade nog ingen förmening I det hele tatt.
We had no understanding at all if what we were doing was worth it or not. You see, nobody ever told us just how much it really was worth, or what importance it could have later on.
I am one of the fortunate who have had no problems after the war. I've had a good health. I have no nightmares. I've been very happy indeed.
I think we're entitled to a little bit of acknowledgement. We didn't get it.